Hi, a very warm and good morning to all of you. Let's start the session number 2 on backend using Spring Boot application. In last session, we have studied about the basics of Spring Boot via GFG source, which is the article of top 10 or top 36 questions asked in a Spring Boot interview. Okay, so now we have completed till question number 19. Now in this session, which is going to be around 1 hour, similar to what we have taken the time in first session. So let's start. So we have done up to this question, like can we create a non-web application in Spring Boot? The answer was yes, we can create non-web applications like microservices, console application and batch application. Let me check if my mic is working properly or not and video is working properly or not. Yes, it is. Let's start. Coming to the next question, describe the flow of HTTP requests through the Spring Boot application. Like what is the flow of HTTP request? First we have client, that is, let's say we have client, then we request, then it goes to the controller layer, then service layer, then it will go to bidirectionally repository layer and model, and then it will go to database, then it will perform some CRUD application, CRUD work, then we get the we go return from repository layer to service layer to controller layer to client, the response one. So first client makes an HTTP request, get, post, put, delete to the browser. After that the request will go to the controller where all the requests will be mapped and handled. After this, in service layer, all the business logic will be performed. It performs the business logic on the data that is mapped to JPA, Java Persistence API, using model classes. In repository layer, all the CRUD operations are being done for the REST APIs. A JSP page is returned to the end user if no errors are there. That is the flow. Like I want to share one of the interview questions that I was asked. What is the difference between post and put? Post is to create the data and put is to update the data. Let me tell you. Like what was the question? What is the difference between post and put request? This was the question that was asked in ION interview. Post is to create a new resource on the server. Put, it is used to create or update an existing resource. Yeah. Coming back, let me write the question. We have to describe the flow of HTTP requests. Flow of HTTPS requests through the Spring Boot application. So we can see via the diagram or via the flowchart. This is very great. Like first we have client, that is us. We request something, then it will go to the controller layer, then it will go to service layer. After that it will go to repository layer, then it will go to model. Yes or no? Yes, model. Then JPA, Java Persistence API. Then we have database. Then CRUD operation is performed. CRUD / native query, and native query, response, service layer, controller layer, then we receive the response. This is the flow. First we have client which request, and then it goes to the controller layer, then service layer, controller layer, service layer, repository layer, model, JPA, database. Let me tell you. Client makes an HTTP request. First step, client makes an HTTP request, which are get, post, put, delete, okay, to the browser. After that the request will go to controller layer, after that the request go to the controller layer, where after that the request will go to the controller layer, where all the requests are mapped. Requests will be mapped and handled. After this, in service layer, after controller layer, it will go to service layer. All the business logic will be performed. Business logic, JPA stands for Java Persistence API. Then the repository layer, all the CRUD operations are being done. CRUD, create, read, update and delete operations are done in the repository layer. CRUD operations for the REST APIs. Then a JSP page is returned. Finally, JSP page is returned to the end users if no errors are there. So this is the flow of HTTP request in a Spring Boot application. Then we have next question. Explain REST controller annotation in Spring Boot. It is like a shortcut to building RESTful services. It combines two annotation, controller and response body. The controller, it marks the class as a request handler in the Spring MVC framework. Then we have response body. It tells the Spring to convert method return values directly into HTTP response instead of rendering views. It enables us to define endpoints for different HTTP methods, get, post, put, delete, return data in various formats like JSON, XML, etc., and map the request parameters to the method arguments. Like the question is, what is the use, or what do you mean by REST controller annotation? REST controller annotation. REST controller annotation is a combination of controller annotation plus response body. Okay. Now the question is, what does the controller annotation do? It marks the class as a request handler in the Spring MVC framework. What does controller do? Controller annotation, what does it do? It marks the class as a request handler, marks the class as a request handler. Okay, it marks the class as a request handler. Okay, then we have response body. Marks the class as a request handler. Response body tells Spring to convert method return values. Convert method return values like objects, data directly into HTTP responses instead of rendering views. Okay, it enables us to define endpoints for different HTTP methods like get, post, put, delete, return data in various formats like JSON, XML, and map the request parameters to the method arguments. So REST controller annotation is a combination of controller and response body. What does the controller annotation do? It marks the class as a request handler. And what does the response body annotation do? It converts method return values like objects and data directly into HTTP responses instead of rendering views. Okay, it enables us to define endpoints for different HTTP methods like get, post, put, delete, return data in various formats like JSON, XML, etc., and map the request parameters to method argument. This is what a REST controller annotation in Spring Boot do. Okay, great. I will provide the notes for sure. Let me see if my camera and video is working properly or not. Yes, it is. That is great. Now the next question. What is the difference between controller annotation and REST controller annotation? Controller annotation. It marks a class as a controller class, like as we have discussed in the previous question. Like what does the controller annotation do? It marks the class as a request handler or as a controller class. REST controller we have just studied. It is a combination of controller and response body. It is used for web application and REST controller is used for RESTful APIs. Okay, so we must study like what is RESTful APIs. This is another question which was asked in one of the interview. It is used with request mapping annotation to map HTTP request with methods used to handle requests like get, put, post, and delete. Both annotation like controller and REST controller handle request, but REST controller prioritizes data responses for building API. Okay, so this is the difference between controller and REST controller. We have in left side controller annotation @ controller annotation. Then on the right side we have REST controller. REST controller. What does controller annotation do? It marks class as a controller class. Marks a class as a controller class. Okay, REST controller is a combination of controller plus response body as we have just discussed. REST controller is a combination of controller plus response body. Controller is used for web applications used for web applications, and REST controller is used for RESTful APIs, used for RESTful APIs. Okay, we will be studying about RESTful APIs because it is one of the important topic that is frequently asked in a interview or whenever you go for a backend interview or any SD even. Then we have used with @request mapping annotation, @request mapping annotation, annotation to map HTTP requests with methods. Okay, used to handle request. REST controller is used to handle requests, used to handle requests like get, put, post and delete. Okay, both are used for handling request, but REST controller prioritizes data responses. @REST controller and @controller both handle requests. Okay, but REST controller annotation prioritizes data responses for building API. Okay, that is great. Now we have to see like what do you mean by RESTful APIs. What is RESTful APIs? These are web services that follow the principles of REST, representational state transfer. They allow different applications to communicate with each other over the internet using HTTP methods. REST is an architectural style. REST is not a protocol or a framework. It is an architectural style. Point to be noted. It is not a framework. It is an architectural style. It is a set of rules for designing scalable and maintainable web APIs. REST separate client, which is front-end mobile app, and server back-end API. They communicate, that is client and server communicate using HTTP request and responses, uses get, post, put, patch, delete. Resources are identified using URLs. Data is represented in JSON or XML. Stateless. Each request from client to server contains all necessary information. Server does not store client session data. RESTful APIs are web services built using REST principle where each resource is accessed via URL. Via URL, operations are performed using standard HTTP methods. Communication is stateless and data is usually exchanged in JSON format. Example REST API URL is this. if you can, I can also give 5 mark answer, real world example. Yeah, so we have studied about like what is REST full APIs. This one, yeah. No, not this one. Yeah. So let me just make the setup perfect to write it, because I'm not able to write it with comfort. Let me take a small pause. Hello. Yeah, now it is great. So let's start. We were studying about RESTful APIs, na? Yeah. Let's start. The next question is, this is a very common asked question, so please be prepared to face it in an interview. What do you mean by RESTful APIs? RESTful APIs. These are web services that allow these are web services. First point, RESTful APIs are web services. Okay, are web services. And what else they do? They follow the principles of REST, which is representational state transfer, okay. They follow the principles of REST, which is representational state transfer. Representational state transfer. REST representational state transfer. Representational state transfer is an architectural structure. Architectural style. It is not a framework, not a protocol. It is an architectural style. It is not a protocol or framework. It is not a protocol or framework. What is REST? It is a set of rules for designing scalable and maintainable web APIs. REST, representational state transfer, is a set of rules. Hi. Hello. Sorry for the disturbance. There was someone in the door. Yeah, on the door. Let's start. So where we were? We were in a REST. REST is a set of principles or rules. It is a set of rules for designing scalable and maintainable web APIs. Okay. Then we have it. What does it do? It separates client and server and allowed to communicate them using HTTP request and responses. REST, which stands for representational state transfer, separates client and server. Okay, it separates client and server. They, which means client and server, communicate using HTTP requests and responses. Okay, that is great. Standard HTTP methods are get, which retrieve the data, post, which create new data, put, update or replace data, patch, partially update data, and delete, the removed data. What does RESTful APIs do? RESTful APIs typically use get, typically use HTTP methods get, which retrieve the data, okay. Post is create new data, okay. Put, update or replace data, replace/update data. Patch, partially update data, delete is for remove the data. Everything in REST is treated as a resource. Resources are identified using URLs. These are some REST principles for maintaining scalable and maintainable web APIs. Okay. The next point is resources are identified using URLs. Okay. Everything in REST is treated as a resource. Data, the output data, maybe we are concerned about this one, is represented either in the form of JSON or XML. Okay. Seventh point, data is represented in JSON or XML. Okay. JSON is lightweight, easy to use, like ID 101, name, Mohit, role, developer. Stateless, REST is stateless. Each request from a client to server contains all necessary information. Server does not store client session data. Server does not store client session data. Uniform interface, same naming style, uniform interface. So in summing up, what we can say, like RESTful APIs are web services built using REST principles where each resource is accessed via a URL. Operations are performed using standard HTTP methods. Communication is stateless. That means server does not store client session data. And data is usually exchanged in JSON format. Example, we are accessing the resource via a URL get http api.example.com users 101 retrieves user with ID 101. That is great. Now coming to next part, what is the difference between request mapping and get mapping in Spring Boot application? Request mapping, it handles various types of HTTP requests like get, post. Get mapping specifically handles HTTP get requests. So request mapping handles various type of HTTP request. Get mapping specifically handles HTTP get request. That is clear by the name also. Like request mapping, it can handle various type of HTTP request. Either it can be GET, POST, etc. But in GET mapping, what it handles, it specifically handles HTTP GET request. Okay. 23rd question, we have request mapping annotation and get mapping annotation. Request mapping annotation handles various types of HTTP requests like get, post, put, patch, delete. Specifically handles HTTP GET request. Specifically handles HTTP GET requests. At the rate request mapping, value is equal to example, method is equal to request method dot get mapping. Yeah. What are the difference between Spring Boot application annotation and enable auto configuration annotation? When to use a Spring Boot application annotation? When we want to use auto configuration, when we want to customize auto configuration, typically used on the main class of a Spring Boot application, serving as the entry point. Can be used on any configuration class or in conjunction with Spring Boot application. Includes component scan annotation to enable component scanning. Does not perform component scanning by itself. Spring Boot application public class my application public static void main string arguments spring application dot run my application dot class argument configuration enable auto configuration public class my configuration. Yeah. The next one we have Spring Boot annotation, Spring Boot application. Okay, Spring Boot application. Then enable auto configuration. Enable auto configuration annotation. Annotation, not annotation, it's annotation. Spring Boot application serves as a entry point, serves as the entry point. Okay, and what about enable auto configuration? Customize auto configuration. Okay, here in Spring Boot application there is a component scan annotation. component scan annotation, which enables what? Component scanning. To enable component scanning, while the enable auto configuration does not perform component scanning by itself, does not perform component scanning. Okay, then what are profiles in Spring Boot or Spring? The 25th question we have we completed 50% of the session or not? This is session number 2, and yeah, we have successfully completed more than 50% of this session, and still 25 minutes is left in this session, which is session number 2. Yeah, I am really excited like how this journey of backend in Spring Boot will go. Like we will be actually implementing these theoretical knowledge in a practical project for sure, and let's see how it will go. But for now, let's go and study 25th question, which is what are profiles in Spring? Okay, so what are profiles in Spring? Spring profiles are like different scenarios for the application depending on the environment. You define set of configurations like database URLs for different situations, development, testing, production. Use the profile annotation to clarify which config belongs to where. Activate profiles with environment variables or command line option. To use Spring profile, we simply need to define the spring.profiles.active property to specify which profile we want to use. They are like different scenarios for the application with depending on the use. Spring profiles are like different scenarios for the application depending on the environment. We define sets of configuration like database URLs for different situation, whether we want to develop or test or product in a production level. We use the profile annotation to clarify which config belongs to where. Okay, and how we can set up Spring profiles? By defining spring.profiles.active property to specify which profile we want to use. Okay, so we have profiles in Spring. They are like different scenarios. Different scenarios for the application. Different scenarios for the application, like if we want like development, testing, production. Different scenarios for the application like development, testing, production. And annotation that we use for profiles in Spring is @profile. Okay, and to use Spring profile, how we do it? By defining spring dot profiles dot active property to specify which profile we want to use. Now the next one. What is the difference between war and embedded containers? So what are the differences between war and embedded containers? War, it contains all of the files needed to deploy a web application to a web server. And what does embedded containers contain? It is a web application server included in the same jar file as the application code. War, it requires external configuration files like web.xml, context.xml to define the web application. Embedded containers uses configuration properties or annotations within the application code. War can be deployed to a web server that is configured with security features or security features. Then we have embedded containers can be made more secure by using security features that are provided by JRE. Okay, so be confident. Like, what do you mean by war and embedded containers? War and embedded containers. War, it contains all the files needed to deploy a web application to a web server. War contains all of the files needed to deploy a web application to a web server. What is embedded containers? It is a web application. It is a web application. It is a web application server included in the same jar file as the application code. What do you mean by war? It contains all of the files needed to deploy a web application to a web server. It is a web application server included in the same jar file as the application code. It requires external configuration files. Requires external configuration files. It requires external configuration files. Example, web.xml, context.xml to define the web application. Okay. It requires external configuration file. Example, web.xml, context.xml to define the web application. Embedded container uses configuration properties or annotations within the application code. Uses configuration properties or annotations within the application code. So we have completed till war and embedded containers. Let me see the duration of this session. It is around 45 minutes and still we have 15 minutes to go. So let's go further. Now we have increased our level. Now we are discussing Spring Boot interview questions for experienced. Now still we have 36. Okay, so we have completed till 26. Let me see all the questions for the first time. These are bonus questions. 14 bonus questions are there, but we are not concerned for that. We are concerned for remaining 10 question from 27 to 36. Yeah, okay. So let's start. What do you mean by Spring Boot actuator? It is a component of the Spring Boot framework that provides production ready operational monitoring and management capabilities. We can manage and monitor our Spring Boot application while it is running. To use Spring Boot actuator, we simply need to add the Spring Boot starter actuator dependency to our project. Like, it allows us to manage and monitor our Spring Boot application while it is running. So it provides production ready operational monitoring, like we have discussed in session number 1 also, like what does actuator do. So we have written, let me tell you where we have written that part. I have written somewhere about actuator, and it was only 1 or 2 word. Actuator maintaining health. CLI was actuator, yeah. Yesterday we have written health check simplifies the troubleshooting management. And what is Spring Boot actuator? We can manage and monitor our Spring Boot application while it is running. Okay. Spring Boot actuator. Spring Boot actuator. What does it do? How we enable it? By simply adding Spring Boot starter actuator. Spring Boot starter actuator dependency, okay, which allows us to manage and monitor our Spring Boot application. Manage and monitor our Spring Boot application. While it is running. Okay, that is great. Now the next one. How to enable actuator in Spring Boot application. First, add actuator dependency. If you want to do X, then you have to add X dependency on it. So like if we want to enable actuator, so what we have to do, enable the actuator dependency or add actuator dependency, then enable endpoints in application.properties, then run our Spring Boot application. Now we can access actuator endpoints at URLs on the management port. Add actuator dependency. How to enable actuator? enable actuator. First, add actuator dependency. Add actuator dependency. Second, enable endpoints in application.properties. Run our Spring Boot application. Run our Spring Boot application. Okay, that is great. Now we can access actuator endpoints at URLs on the management port. Then what is the purpose of using component scan in the class file? It detects Spring component configuration and services to configure without arguments, with base package class, with base package. So what is the purpose of using component scan? Like, what does it do? It automatically scans a package and detect the Spring component configuration and services to configure. What does component scan annotation do? @ component scan annotation. What does it do? Scan a package. Okay, scan a package and automatically detect what? Spring components, configurations, and service to configure. It can be used without argument, with base package classes, with base package, like component scan annotation can be used without arguments, with base package classes, with base packages. Okay. What are the request mapping and REST controller annotation in Spring Boot used for? So we have studied like what is request mapping do? What does it do? Yeah, it maps or handles various HTTP methods. Handles various types of HTTP request. Okay, and REST controller is a combination of, we have already studied, controller and response body. It indicates a controller where every method returns a domain object instead of a view. Now let's see the time. Yeah, still 6 minutes are left. We will try to cover it, all these questions, as fast as possible. Next one, how to get the list of all beans in our Spring Boot application. Using the application context object in Spring Boot, we can retrieve a list of all the beans in our application. The application context is responsible for managing the beans and their dependencies. Okay, so the next question, that is 31, which is to get the list of all beans, we can use application context object. in Spring Boot, we can list all of our beans. List of all the beans can be retrieved using application context object. Can we check the environment properties in our Spring Boot application? How? Yes, we can check the Spring Boot application environment properties. The environment object in a Spring Boot application can be used to check the environment's properties. Configuration settings for the application includes property files, command line arguments, environment variables. We can get the environment instance by calling the get environment method. Okay, so the question is like, can we check the environment properties in our Spring Boot application? Yes, we can check the Spring Boot application's environment properties. The environment object in a Spring Boot application can be used to check the environment's properties. Okay, question is, environment object can be used to check the environment properties in our Spring Boot application. And remember, application context object was used for listing all the beans in our Spring Boot application. And if we want to check the environment properties, then you can use environment object to check the environment properties. We can get the environment instance by calling the get environment method. How to enable debugging log in the Spring Boot application? The question is how to enable debugging log. Add the logging level property to application.properties. Configure the log pattern. Run it. So we can add the following code to enable debugging log in Spring Boot application. Okay, if we want to enable debugging log, then how we can do this? First, we go to application.properties. Okay, application.properties. Here we add the logging level property. Okay, logging level property. After that, what we will do? We will configure the log pattern. Then after that, run the Spring Boot application. By doing these steps, we can enable debugging log in Spring Boot application. First, adding the logging level property to application.properties, then configure the log pattern, then run the Spring Boot application. Using the actuator endpoint, the log level can also be changed at runtime. Curl this one. Now the last three questions are left, 34, 35 and 36. Let me see the time. It is exact 1 hour. So we will be extending this session little bit for covering up the last three questions. Yeah, let's start. What is dependency injection and its type? Dependency injection is a design pattern that enables us to produce loosely coupled component. In dependency injection, an object's ability to complete a task depends on another object. There are three types of dependency injections: constructor injection, setter injection, field injection. Constructor injection, this is the most common type of dependency injection in Spring Boot. In constructor injection, the dependency object is injected into the dependent object's constructor. Setter injection, in setter injection, the dependency object is injected into the dependent object's setter method. Field injection, in field injection, the dependency object is injected into the dependent object's field. What is an IOC container? I will be writing question number 34, 35 and 36 in one go. So let me complete it by reading. What is an IOC container? An IOC, inversion of control container in Spring Boot, is essentially a central manager for the application object that controls the creation, configuration and management of dependency injection of objects, often referred to as beans, also referred to as a DI, dependency injection container. What is the difference between constructor and setter? Dependencies are provided through constructor parameters. Dependencies are set through setter methods after object creation. Constructor injection promotes immutability as dependencies are set at creation. Setter injection, dependencies can be changed dynamically after object creation. Harder to override dependencies with different implementations. Allows easier overriding of dependencies using different setter values. Okay, what we will do, we will go a bonus session for these 14 questions where we'll be just reading these ones, not writing. Yeah, so let's start writing from here. Dependency injection and its types. Dependency injection. It produces loosely coupled components. It produces loosely coupled components. DI, we have constructor injection, then we have setter injection, field injection. Third one we have field injection. What is happening in constructor injection? Dependency object is injected into the dependent object's constructor. Okay, and what does dependency injection do? It allows an object to complete a task depends on another object. One simple line for dependency injection is: in DI, an object's ability To complete a task, depends on another object. Similarly, we can write like in setter injection, dependency object is injected into the dependent setters method, dependent objects setter method. Or and in field injection, what we can write, the dependency object is injected into the dependent objects field. What is an IOC container? What is an IOC container? What is an IOC container? It is inversion of control. Inversion of control, which is a central manager for the application object. IOC, inversion of control container in Spring Boot, is a central manager. For the application objects. Central manager for the application objects, which controls the creation. It controls the creation, configuration. Third one, management of dependency injection of objects, often referred to as beans. Management of dependency injection. Management of dependency injection of objects, often referred to as beans. Often referred to as beans. Also referred to as a DI container. Direction dependency injection. DI container. Yeah. IOC, inversion of control container in the Spring Boot, is essentially a central manager for the application objects that controls the creation, configuration, and management of dependency injection of objects, often referred to as beans, also referred to as a DI, dependency injection. Now the next one. What is the difference between constructor injection and setter injection? Constructor injection, as we have told you, that dependencies are provided through dependent objects constructor. Then in setter, dependencies are set through dependent object setter. It is immutable, promotes immutability in constructor, but in setter, dependencies can be changed. Dynamically after object creation. Harder to override because it is immutable, with harder to override dependencies with different implementation. Allows easier overriding of dependencies using different setter values. So that is the end of Spring Boot interview questions. We have discussed 36 questions from beginners to intermediate to experienced one. In next session, that will be a very small session that will contain only bonus questions from the for the interview, where I will be discussing these 14 questions, and I will not write this, but yeah, I will be discussing. So with that said, this session is around 1 hour 10 minutes, and that is the end of session 2 on backend Spring Boot. In further sessions, I will be definitely coming up with the practical application of Spring Boot backend developer. Till then, be positive, smile, and positive. Thank you.